Well, we're here today to discuss transforming disaster risk reduction and financing in Africa. Mami Mizutori from the UNDRR, Ibrahima Cheikh Diong from the African Risk Capacity Group. Let's start by talking about the recent shift in approach, if anything, the connection between climate change and DRR. Mami first.
So previously I would say that connection was not there really. There was this community of people who thought about disaster risk reduction, the hazard and exposure and vulnerability, and then the climate community, which looked at all the climate risks and their impact. Now we know that 90% of all disasters are related somewhat to climate. So we do need to bring this together. And what does that mean? It means that we need to bring the historical loss and damage from disaster data, information, and currently what's happening on the ground about the exposure, the vulnerability, combining it with the climate community's information and data and knowledge about the future probabilistic risk. If we don't put this together, people at any level, national, local, community, cannot have what we call a risk-informed policy or decision.
Ibrahim, I presume you're aligned
I
with
think
that.
if we stick to science, as Mami said earlier, and that is that there are two angles that you can see as the connection. Number one, the extreme weather situation obviously is contributing to extreme weather situation, in this case, drought or flooding. So the sea rise across Africa certainly has an impact on flood, and that's something that we need to recognize as a connection between the two, and it's something that I think becoming a consensus over time. This is certainly a connection that's right there directly. I think the other connection, which is the one particularly I think keen on, and that's the human face, and that is the fact that a lot of vulnerable communities across Africa are affected by the extreme weather situation. So therefore, that connection is there. The question is, what are we going to do about it?
What's happening in the DRR sense in Africa?
Well, in the case of Africa, the problem that we're faced with, and if I look at a couple of disaster-related situations, first of all, drought in many African countries, particularly in the Sahel, because of drought, has an impact directly on food security. In some cases, like the communities are selling their asset to survive. You can say the same thing about flood and tropical cyclone as well. So therefore, that as a problem, it is something that has been around for quite some time. The question, what are we going to do about it, to at least have the information, as Mami said, and an early system, warning systems that allows us to take some actions.
How would you describe the global DRR scenario?
So the global DRR scenario, which also applies to Africa too, by the way, is that we are living in a multi-hazard world. COVID-19 has been with us already, 19 months or almost 2 years. But during such time, the other hazards, whether it's a volcano eruption, whether it's an earthquake, and of course all the climate-related hazards, cyclone, flood, droughts, they're coming to us all together, right? So that's what's happening, and that is what is really aggravating the situation. The other thing is that we are facing what's called a systemic nature of risk, which is one thing leads to another. COVID-19 is the perfect example, a public health crisis turning into a socio-economic crisis that affects each and every sector of our society. So this is what we are facing, and here we do need to have a systematic solution. But I would say that within this, still, or now even more than ever, climate emergency is the biggest risk driver.
Why should governments therefore move from relief for prevention and preparedness culture? Let me ask you, Mami, first.
Well, basically because we are caught in this cycle of disaster response, recovery, reconstruction, and disaster. And the cycle is getting, how would I say, smaller and smaller, or quicker and quicker because of the intensity and the frequency of disasters. And now it is not sustainable anymore that there's a disaster and there's a response. The response, the amount of humanitarian assistance that you need, and thinking about the African risk capacity, the risk, the amount of risk that can be transferred, there's a limit to it, right? Insurance is very important, but but because of the intensity and frequency, we cannot transfer that much risk, we cannot respond to that much humanitarian assistance need.
You're obviously part
I
of
think
that
I will
cycle.
certainly join Mami on that, just to recognize that the government has a huge responsibility in making sure we come up with sustainable solutions in dealing with the impact of disaster. I talked about the impact it has on vulnerable communities, but I also joined Mami in agreeing that insurance is not the only solution. And there are other instruments out there that are available, social safety net and other contingency planning that government can come up together. What's important, the insurance and then the other solution combined will provide actually the solution for government to actually anticipate, because the problem with disaster, if you wait till it happens, it may be too late. So the importance of anticipating early warning is such allows government to get the information they need to make informed decisions about what part of the risk they would like to retain, what part of the risk they would like to transfer as a government.
So how can we help African governments to improve their planning and preparations so far as extreme weather events are concerned?
I think a couple of things we could do, and I think Mami and I spoke about this almost quite often, and that is to say the early warning system is extremely important in the sense disaster, particularly related to weather, doesn't just happen. You can certainly anticipate through climate technology and so on to be able to at least get the visibility on the risk profile of the country. I think number one is really to help the African government to have the visibility so they can make an informed decision when it comes to climate risk transfer. I think second, just to have what we call some strong contingency planning within the country, whereby even when we intervene, it's aligned with the overall contingency planning of the country. So it's not something isolated. And I think the response, as we talked about earlier, it is insurance is one aspect, but we may look at other innovative financing instrument that we can make available to the African countries so we can match the supply and demand and find some solutions. Mami, what do you think?
I think you're absolutely right. And when you think about the insurance industry, one very important thing is the data you have, right? So ARC, African Response Capacity, African Risk Capacity, has been doing a lot of risk profiling in countries. And this is, as you have mentioned right now, the foundation for risk-informed policy. And you have a lot of accumulated data, also disaggregated data, which can inform the countries to have a disaster risk reduction policy which looks at the vulnerabilities of the communities, which looks at the exposure of the communities. So really, you mentioned that as an instrument, it's important, but I would say as an instrument, it's important, but the wealth of data that you have, the wealth of information you have is very important. And that's why it's crucial that Africa has its own insurance capacity in the African risk capacity.
So how can UNDRR and ARC work in partnership to achieve this?
So we have always worked together, but we are now enhancing our work together because we have to really leverage Ibrahima's knowledge and information about the risk profile of the countries. We will work with Ibrahima so that these risk profiles can be truly embedded in the policy work of the African governments, which is not really used. It will also be very instrumental in encouraging the governments and saying, look, this is your risk profile, take a look at it. You need to put in much more money into your national budget for prevention, which is on average globally, I'm not talking only about Africa, globally 1% of the budget. And this is just not right. If the governments know and face it squarely, all the risks that they're surrounded by, they need to put in more budget into prevention.
I think what I will add to that, just to say that I think Mami and I talk about it quite often. There are a couple of things we can do, and it's a concrete action that we can take. Number one, the culture of disaster risk management is not embedded in many public policy discourse in many African countries. And I think we can join forces and make sure we can build that culture so you can anticipate before actually it happens. The way we've been doing it, by using evidence. In other words, countries where we've been impactful through what we do and make sure that we can save lives. I think second, as Mami said earlier, as we diversify our product offering, one of the biggest challenges is to have access to reliable data and knowledge that organization sits on that we can leverage on to make sure we can build reliable models so the government can make decisions. I think last but not least, it's extremely important in our line of work, we make sure also take into account what we're trying to save, the vulnerable communities. So tell those stories in a way that actually demonstrate that in the long run, our objective is really to save the life of many Africans or many people around the world who are faced with the impact of climate change.
I was going to bring up the storytelling part of it.
Yes,
Mami.
yes. So the storytelling part is very important, and we're not only going to tell the stories about the doom and gloom. We're going to tell the stories together about how building resilience can build the community, can sustain the development gains, and those stories, as you said, has a face to it. Now, many times we think about women and girls, people living with disability, indigenous people as vulnerable people who need to be protected. Well, that's true, right? But they are very forceful agents of change, especially in Africa. The power of African women is well known, right? But it's something that we need to not talk in general abstract terms, but give a face to this lady who works in her community, who is a mayor in her city, who is building resilience locally and also at the national level as well. So these are the stories that we want to tell together, unless people will not be convinced that investing in prevention, investing in disaster risk reduction, investing in climate adaptation is an investment and it's not a cost. We need these stories to really buttress this argument.
Evidence-based advocacy does support promotion of risk knowledge.
Absolutely, and I want to underscore the point that Mami made earlier, that is the woman. Gender is extremely important in our discourse, in the sense, if you look at the majority of vulnerable communities, in the case of Africa, they happen to be women. So if you want to be actually effective and impactful, you got to mainstream your intervention whereby woman, it's not just a lip service, it's something that's actually, it makes sense to do that, because ultimately, if our mission, our objective is to protect vulnerable communities, women have to be at the center of what we do. But I think what's also important to underscore, in our case, what I have just described is no longer just a concept, it's been tested. The question is, how do we move from actually this something that's been tested to scale it up so we can actually increase the coverage across Africa and make Africa more resilient?
Ibrahima Cheikh Diong, Mami Mizutori, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.